Perfect. Well, hi everyone. Good morning and welcome to the July of 2019 Coffee and CU event that the DBA hosts every single month. This is a free event that we do for DBA members, and we're so very happy for you to be here. Today, we have our chair, Ashley, who is going to be presenting today. And I'm going to read a really quick bio on Ashley so you get to know her before she starts her presentation. So Dr. Ashley Fiorilli has worked in the field of developmental disabilities for 13 years. She graduated from Barry University with a bachelor's in psychology in 2005. She began her career as a service coordinator, which led to her passion in the field of ABA, which led her to further her education by pursuing a master's degree in counseling with a focus on ABA. She graduated from NOAA Southeastern University. Woo! I was there as well. In 2009. She initially worked with infants and toddlers with developmental disabilities, as well as those who were deaf and hard of hearing or visually impaired. Within the last 10 years, she has worked with individuals with autism and related disabilities in school, home, clinic, and group settings. A personal interest in travel, as well as working within multicultural areas, led her to pursue her doctorate in international psychology with an emphasis in organizations and systems from the Chicago School of Psychology, professional psychology. She completed her dissertation in 2014, which has a title of Autism in Children, a Phenomenological Study of South African Caregivers. Oh, interesting. She has presented at both state and national conferences. She has provided on ground consultation and trainings in Bahrain and Portugal to both parents and staff implementing ABA technologies. She is a member of the California Association of Behavior Analysis, ABAI, and the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton on to Ashley.
Thanks, Annie. Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to dive into incorporating ACT into behavioral analytic sessions. I'll go through some case studies and just kind of how the implementation of ACT has kind of progressed in my practice. And so one of the first things that I kind of want to talk about or touch on is sometimes I hear people say ACT, sometimes people say ACT. It is ACT, it's not ACT, so just clarifying how you're referring to it when you're talking about it in the professional community. So just kind of a point of note for that as well. All right, so let's get my slides going. Oh, technical difficulty, my slide won't advance. Ah, there we go. Oh, too fast. Okay, so these are today's objectives, and I'm going to go briefly through the kind of processes of ACT, and we'll do a couple experiential activities. I'll go through the cases, and then hopefully at the end you'll be able to identify some things that are measurable about ACT, because I think as some behavior analysts in the private events world, how to measure private events is a little scary, and so looking at these as behavioral repertoires and how to measure the behavioral repertoire. And so kind of a question to everyone in the chat or in the webinar, if you could just type a message maybe of how familiar you are with ACT, and if it's like novice, beginner, intermediate, totally advanced, just to give me some idea of how much detail maybe to put into the overview. Okay, so intermediate, novice, beginner. Okay, beginner. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for that. So it won't be super in-depth, so that way we can get to the case study components, but it will hopefully be able to kind of touch on each of the processes so you have the understanding of that. So first and foremost, ACT is based in relational frame theory, which for the purpose of today's webinar, I'm not necessarily going to dive into RFT and what that looks like, but just knowing that the language components are a huge aspect of how you're integrating some of the core processes of ACT. And so I have some resources at the end to dive into that a little bit more if you're wanting to. So ACT was first published in 1999, and that really came out of individuals who were kind of quote unquote suffering. And so I might use some of the mentalistic words of like suffering, so bear with me, behavior analysts. Um, so the goal really of ACT when it came out is to alleviate human suffering. And so really what that is looking at is individuals with anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations, anything that language provides a moment of kind of disconnect or suffering internally is kind of that an ongoing goal of ACT per se. And so from our standpoint of not necessarily maybe using the word suffering within behavior analytic services, but we all write coping goals. You know, Johnny will cope so many times maybe in the presence of an aversive stimuli. So we're using a different kind of term for suffering. We're qualifying it. We're operationally defining what it looks like specific for that individual. So just keeping that in mind. The 6 core processes that we have are, and they're paired up together, and I have the hexaflex on the next slide that we'll go through, but fusion and diffusion are paired together. Avoidance, acceptance, self as content, self as context, inaction versus committed action, past or future thinking versus present moment thinking, and then a lack of directions versus being value driven. And so this is my favorite version of the hexaflex. It came straight off the Google, and it was in a blog, but it didn't have a lot of context of where it actually came from. I personally like it because of the different colors, and when you look at this, all of the things that are highlighted in pink, so those parts of the hexaflex that are highlighted in pink are the processes of ACT that keep us in what could be called psychological inflexibility. And so they're all connected to each other because in order to be present, or if you are thinking about the past or thinking about what's going to happen in the future, there's an aspect of that cognitive fusion that's happening. So they're identified as separate processes, but they're very much interrelated in how they work together to move forward with flexibility or to be kind of stuck in what we call inflexibility. Okay. And so this hexaflex is kind of really what we'll come back to towards the end after I go through each of the processes. So for the first set, fusion and diffusion, and fusion, diffusion, these were words that were kind of made up to go along with the model. So you won't necessarily, when you say diffusion, people will be like, what are you talking about? And so if you've ever had that feeling of, I'm so stuck in this thought process in this moment right now, or I'm stuck with this parent, I can't get them to take data, they keep telling me they don't have time, that is a moment of being fused to maybe what's happening in the situation. And that's kind of related to our field, but we could probably all come up with our own ideas of how we're fused to thoughts that happen throughout our daily events and things like that. So the idea of diffusion is basically looking at how to detach or distance yourself from that thought. So to be able to become kind of an observer of the thought, so that way the thought isn't controlling you and isn't necessarily keeping you stuck in that moment. So if you're able to distance, you're able to make a choice of how to move differently in that situation versus feeling like you're continually stuck. And this is where RFT does come into play in terms of recognizing how certain thoughts connect to each other. So if you kind of build out a little RFT network of all the thoughts, feelings, and things that are associated with something that's challenging, that's where the understanding of RFT comes in to support ACT processes. So I've got 2 activities for us to do, and I'm presenting them in the way that I would probably present them to some clients, so that way you have an experience that way rather than more of a, I guess, an adult version of ACT, I guess, for the way to say. So this activity for diffusion comes from the Accept, Identify, Move curriculum, which I we'll go through some more. But so hopefully everyone has a piece of paper next to them. And so this specific activity is called Miserable to Magical. It's actually one of my favorite to do with the kids. And so on your piece of paper, write down one word that typically, when you think of this word, it maybe produces a little bit of challenge with you. So the word used for this for the kids is stupid. And that's like, some kids will kind of come up with like, well, I didn't do okay on my homework, I felt stupid, and when somebody calls me stupid, this is how I feel. So they would write stupid on a piece of paper. So take a couple seconds, write your word on a piece of paper, and a couple of you give me some indications that you're writing your words down. Okay, everybody kind of got a word on their paper? All right, so yes, great, thank you. So with your piece of paper, this is gonna seem really weird, but we're gonna spend 30 seconds staring at that word. You're just gonna fully dive in to your word, stare at it for, say, the next 30 seconds. If things feel uncomfortable when you're staring at the word, that might happen. Okay, now that we've spent some time staring at the word, does anybody want to type or share anything that came up while they were staring at their word? How do you feel right now? Fused. Okay, stuck to your word. Anybody else feel like, yeah, attached to their word, maybe like, oh, this isn't what I wanted to stare at in the morning. I feel a little confused, curious. Okay, some different things. Okay, so now you're going to take your word and you are going to draw it into an animal. You're going to pick whatever animal that you want to draw to transform that word into. So I've had kids do like unicorns, horses. So take a minute or two and transform that word into your favorite animal. And then when you get to a point where you feel like your animal looks like an animal, give me a chat message so I know if a couple people have gotten there. Okay, got one person ready. Got a stick figure. Hey, stick figures are art. Okay, so now that we have our word animal, hopefully it's transformed enough where now when you stare at it, we're going to stare at it again for another 30 seconds. So stare at your word animal. And now how does it feel when you stare at your word, when you look at your word? Do you still feel fused? Do you feel confused? Curious? What comes up now? Confused but the bear silly. Great, silly. Okay. Anything else? Softer, entertained. So this is a really good diffusion exercise for kids because it puts the ability to distance yourself from the thought in a more physical aspect. And sometimes I'll get, I've gotten responses from clients of like, well, it seems less scary when I stare at the word, or I feel a little bit better because I've made it fun and I've made it silly. So that is a diffusion exercise and activity. And so there's a lot of different contact points on the way to diffuse. And so trying out multiple ones with clients and kind of doing preference assessments with them to figure out what might work for them is a good way to kind of go with that. Okay, thanks for participating, everybody. So we're gonna move on to, okay. So on this side, we have avoidance and acceptance. And so really what I want to highlight with acceptance is I think sometimes there's confusion of, I don't want to accept the way that things are, and like feel like you're resigning to something in the way that you're accepting it. But really acceptance is just a willingness to experience what's happening in that present moment. Willingness to kind of go like, this is a crappy situation and I'm willing to sit with that. And what's happening right now is happening right now, as opposed to, I want to try and avoid those situations because it makes me feel upset, or I don't want to do it, or I'm not good at it. So this might be with clients, the things that come to mind of like sportsmanship programs that I've done with kids of, well, I don't want to play that game because I lost it last time. And I don't want to try that again because, you know, I didn't know the rules. So the avoidance of experiencing the potential kind of negative things in that situation is the other side of being willing to sit and accept, I might win, I might lose, I'm not sure what's going to happen, whatever happens, I'm willing to experience it. So self is content and self is context, and I just realized the slide here is a little funky, so I apologize about that. This, I think, is probably one of the processes that's a little more like woo-woo for behavior analysts, I'll say. And so if we look at self as content, it's kind of the concern and the labels that we put on ourselves that we feel stuck or we feel fused to. So if I said, well, I'm a BCBA, I'm a runner, I'm a yogi, and then maybe I broke my leg and my internet like couldn't work for whatever reason, then I could go like, then I might start to suffer because the label of I'm a yogi and I'm a runner, I can't apply those labels to myself right then in those moments because my leg is broken. So that starts to input some suffering into what I'm experiencing. And so self as context is really that piece of me that's always observing and knowing where I'm the same and where I change based off of the environments that I'm in, the content that I'm surrounding. So we're going to do a self as context activity, and this one's called the rock. It's also from the AIM curriculum. And so what I want everyone, you feel free to, if you visualize things better with your eyes closed, feel free to close your eyes. But picture a rock next to a stream. And so it's maybe the only thing in a meadow. There's the rock, the meadow, and the stream. And you're going to picture that rock in springtime. And note how the rock is different in springtime. And kind of take note of anything that's on the rock, around the rock, anything that you create of what the rock might look like in springtime. Now we're going to picture that rock in summertime. How does the rock change in summertime, and how does the rock stay the same? So what happens with the things that maybe were sprouting up in spring versus summertime? So picture that. And now shift that visualization of the rock in fall. So what's around fall, or what's around the rock in fall time? How does it look different? How does it stay the same? And kind of create that picture in your mind. And then now let's shift to the rock in wintertime. And how does the rock look different in winter? What's on the rock? What's around the rock? Maybe what's the lake doing kind of next to the rock, part of the environment? How's the rock stay the same? So we've kind of gone through this rock in different seasons. There's portions of the rock that have changed, and there's portions of the rock that have stayed the same. So the question to you individually would be, how are you like the rock? And if you want to share some thoughts in the chat box, but considering how do you change and how do you stay the same like this rock in the different seasons? So the idea is the environment, you know, we change based off of our environment, but there's core things of us that stay the same. So the rock is always hard, always a solid mass. Depending on how long the rock has been there might be some erosion and things like that, but within the different seasons, you know, there's growth on the rock, there's moss on the rock, there's snow, there's fall. So there's the pieces that constantly change, and there's the pieces that stay the same. And that in itself, and understanding kind of how you stay the same and how you are different, is the self as context versus self as content. Okay. So moving on to the next processes, inaction versus committed action. I feel like this is a part, as behavior analysts, we can kind of go like, I get committed actions. I get how to measure observable behavior. And so really, when you're looking at the committed actions, it's a value-driven action. It's observable, it's behaviorable, that's what can be measurable, and then components. And the inaction component is really the lack of behavior change in that situation. There's the constant staying fused to the thought, fused to the ideas that are happening, versus understanding what the values are in that situation and moving towards the values. So values and committed actions go quite nicely together. And so within the values, so sometimes it's hard to kind of talk about values with kids and with clients and kind of going like, well, what matters to you? And what, you know, depending on the age of the client, like, well, what type of student do you want to be? What type of brother or sister do you want to be? What type of friend do you want to be? Kind of diving into some of those questions a little bit more and understanding what values come out of that. Values could also be really concrete as like the thing that the kid's working for, the reinforcer. I value that thing because it might be fun to me, so I want to get that reinforcer. Versus kind of having a lack of direction, thinking most of the time, if you're setting goals and kind of going goal, 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 and you're not necessarily maybe meeting goals, or you're just continuing to set goals, there's not really, the goal aspect isn't necessarily driven by the value itself. And typically goals are put onto us by our family members, cultural, society aspects, as opposed to this is what I really want as an individual, and this is what I'm going to use to make my choice. And so the last process is past or future thinking versus present moment thinking. And I think we can all probably think of a family, a staff member, a client, where it's like, well, I don't want to implement the behavior plan because what if he screams at me? What if he falls on the floor? What if he hits me? That's all future thinking. And we need to kind of come back, at least parent support, it's helpful to be like, hey, how do we come back to this moment right now? We don't know what's going to happen when you introduce this behavior plan. We can hypothesize maybe there's an extinction burst, so we're going to talk you through that. But how do we connect with that present moment and understand what's happening right here? So having families take ABC data is a really great way to be in the present moment, because they have to be there, they have to watch, they have to use those specific observable, measurable terms, and they're not personalizing things in that situation. So really the idea is, can you be in the present moment? Can you be here? Can you be now? And if you notice yourself kind of getting caught up in past or future thinking, how do we get back to the present moment? So that way we are able to have more flexibility and choice in what we're doing. So back to the Hexaflex, and I'm trying to navigate my notes on my phone at the same time. So I've got an example here of how this might work together. And so if we're looking at this hexaflex, and I'm going to kind of first give the pink version, we'll say. So client example, client might say, I don't want to try new foods. They're throwing the food from their plate onto the floor. They don't like to try, like, I don't like to try new things. That's just not who I am. I don't like to try new things. I know what I like. I don't want to try anything different. Plus, the last time I tried this, I threw up the food. Why do I want to try this again, Mom? So like that is sometimes the conversation we have with clients who have that ability. And so within that example, I've heard avoidance of the situation. I've heard self as content because I don't like to try new things. It's like, well, I'm a person who doesn't like to try new things. I know that I don't like it. I know I don't like new things. So I'm fused to that idea. And last time I did this, I threw up. So I'm past thinking in that situation. So if we're able to maybe work with this client and we say, okay, like, hey, Johnny, what are some things that you find important for yourself? And Johnny comes up with maybe, well, I really like to be curious and I like playful things. So we take those values and we can incorporate it potentially into that type of situation. And kind of setting up the context of, so like, okay, Johnny, we're gonna put the plate of food here. You don't have to try it. We're just gonna leave it right here. And if he leaves the plate there, that's the willingness to experience the situation. That's the acceptance of the situation. Maybe we do a mindful eating activity with a food preference assessment. So we're kind of going, here's the things that you like. Now let's have play and curiosity around how we're eating it. Let's eat it really slow. Let's eat it really fast. Let's talk about the difference between those. Those are present moment ways to stay in the moment, as opposed to, if I put something new in my mouth, I'm going to throw it up. Some of the AIM curriculum goes through creating mantras for kids. And so, okay, what's your curiosity mantra? Let's kind of go through what can we talk to ourselves about when we want to try something and we want to be curious about it. And so creating a little mantra of like, curiosity rules. Well, I don't know, something fun that they could come up with. And that way, when you are trying the new food, you agreeing to go like, hey, my action is going to be, do we want to smell it? Do we want to taste it? Which one has more curiosity with it? Maybe they're like, well, I don't smell my food. Maybe smelling my food is a way to be curious about it. Great. Let's have our mantra. Let's have our committed action. And let's try smelling all of these different foods that we have in front of us. So you can see how they work together in that situation to promote flexibility for even just trying new foods. Okay. So I see the question. I'm gonna get through the slides and then we'll come back to questions at the end. Okay. Just so that way we don't run out of slide time. Okay, so I'm gonna go through some case studies and some different approaches with ACT. And so the first case I have, he was 6 when I was working with him. His diagnoses were autism, mild CP, pretty high functioning. He had previously had early intervention, and he was discharged around 3. So there's about 3 years of a gap between when he came for referred for social skills and coping strategies. And so one of the biggest targets that the family had wanted to work on was his ability to transition upstairs and sportsmanship during gameplay, because he was like flipping game boards over, leaving, screaming, and he was refusing to transition upstairs by himself. There was some fear of family would not be there when I come back downstairs. So one of the things that we did was what's called the values choice point. And so there's a picture of it on the right here, and this was a version I decided to draw out. There's a paper-based version that could be filled in and put in a specific area. But the idea is at the bottom of the choice point, there's a kind of challenging situation. And with that challenging situation, there comes a choice. And there comes a choice to either move towards your values, which is the right side of it. And the other choice is moving away from your values, which is the left side of it. And so within this process, we map out what happens if we're moving away? What is it? Maybe what are we saying to ourselves? What's happening in the environment? And if there's any bodily sensations that the kid wants to report, kind of that's documented. Versus the right side of moving towards values, it's like, okay, if we made the choice to move towards our values, what might that look like? What are the things that might happen in the environment? What could we say to each other in that situation? And so in this, we've got the values and the committed actions, and there's also a piece of being present to be able to sit and recognize what's happening in the present moment to be able to make that choice. And so, excuse me, the modification I kind of made specific to this client was, while we were playing games, each time there was something listed on either moving towards or moving away, I just drew an arrow versus stars. And the idea is he can make whatever choice he wants. There's no consequence space for the choice that he's making, other than just the reminder of like, hey, looks like we're moving away the value, versus we're moving towards. And so this is one that we did after a couple sessions. So it has 6 moving away versus 15 moving towards. The original one that we did was probably like 20 moving towards, or moving away, sorry, versus like 2 moving towards the value. And so that was pretty helpful for him in terms of being able to make it through the gameplay, because he really wanted to play the game and didn't understand when he talks about, I didn't win the last time, I'm not sure what's going to happen this time, that it actually took away from the gameplay, and mapping it out this way gave him the context and the visual to be able to kind of go like, no, I still want to have fun, and this is how I do it. So this was specific in reducing his negative comments during play and overall the gameplay duration. And so we actually ended up training the mom on how to create her own choice point for transitions specifically. And it was very, like, I don't have the data for it. I'm going to say bad behavior analyst. But we did one version of the choice point to transition, and he immediately transitioned upstairs. He went by himself, no problem. And he was able to say like, hey mom, when you tell me multiple times to go upstairs, it doesn't help me. And then we're like, okay, what can mom say? And he was like, you can tell me, like, you got it, you can do this, you're in charge. And so he came up with his own little script. And so mom did that, and after that, I mean, I checked in, it was parent training, so it wasn't a lot of frequent sessions, but every 2 weeks we had a check-in. And the transitions after that initial discussion, when he recognized his value of being independent and talking through the situation of what moves towards and what moves away, he transitioned independently from then on, which was a really cool process to see. And to have mom be able to understand how to create that choice point herself as well. So case study number 2, 16 years old, autism, anxiety, depression, previous experience with ABA kind of as a younger adolescent, and she came to us for social skills group. And so we were originally targeting social skills and adaptive daily living skills. There was a lot of homework refusal that was happening, and kind of the perfectionist mindset of like, well, if I don't get an A, I don't know if I'm going to get an A, so why should I try to do this? And so there was a lot of missed homework opportunities, or homework just wasn't getting done. And so this is where we started to incorporate some different materials. And so the AIM, the Accept, Identify, Move, that's the blue book that you see there. And it actually has a psychological flexibility questionnaire, which is helpful to kind of see where a client may potentially fall on being psychologically flexible. And it's helpful to say, like, maybe this is the lowest scored one, so we can actually target more of those type of activities and practice those and build up the behavioral repertoire for that. And then we did something that's called AIM boxes. And so there's 3 boxes on a piece of paper. One is an accept box, one is an identify, and one is a move box. And so the client is writing out, this is something I find difficult to accept. This is something I want to get better at. I want to identify something to get better at. And this is something I want to do to move towards the thing I want to get better at. So we have acceptance, value, and committed actions on that paper. And so an example of that might be, it's difficult for me to accept I don't have a lot of friends. I want to get better at being friendly to people, value being friendly. And the action for that might be, I'll greet people when they come into my house. So it's still very specific, observable, measurable in that move section where you can take data on that behavior that you're looking for, and not necessarily creating like a list of like, well, I can say hi to people, I could engage in conversation, I could do all these things. It's really to focus on one specific piece of the way to move towards that value. So I have, and so we did use the choice point for her as well to start with. And so this was kind of the task analysis that we put together in order to complete the choice point, because we wanted her to be able to do it on her own in that situation. Oops, sorry. Trying to move this box over. So she got the concept pretty quickly, and what we were finding is the latency to homework and to actually start homework reduced, and there was some kind of clunky data collection because we originally started with the duration of homework, thinking if we can shorten the duration it's taking her to do homework because of all the thoughts and things that are coming up that are preventing. That was the initial way that we went with it. But because she's in high school and homework becomes very complex, it wasn't a consistent measure, so we changed to latency. And then we shifted into, so this is her data for creating the AIM box. So the big one on the left side here is the ability to complete the accept, identify, move box by herself. And then the thing that happens at the next session, so if we create the AIM box at the end of session A, on the start of session B, we do what's called checking the AIM. So there's a rating scale of 1 to 5, and this goes along with the AIM curriculum, that she is rating how well she did at accepting, how well she did at identifying the thing, and then how well she moved towards it. So you can see she's scored herself as pretty high as accepting the things. Consistently identifying the values is variable, as well as checking the move and actually making contact with the committed action is variable too. So these are pieces we're now integrating into parent training, so that way we can have two sets of data to compare outside of the self-report measures. So case study number 3, so 19 years old, autism, anxiety, depression. And so actually one thing I want to say is the case studies 2, 3, and 4, they all do have psychological counseling on the side because of the anxiety and depression diagnoses as well. So it's not just our services. I wanted to clarify that. So she's referred for social skills and coping. And so the shift that I kind of made from case study 2 to case study 3 is being able to actually identify the ACT processes and the willingness to experience those activities as the behavioral repertoire. So being able to say, okay, here's our hexaflex. What do these processes mean? We'll do an activity, then kind of go like, hey, which activity do you think that we just did? So being able to kind of teach the hexaflex to know, oh, this is diffusion and this is what this means. So when I practice these things, this is what I need to kind of come in contact with. So she had the AIM boxes as well, and we've started to do preference assessments with the experiential activities. So to kind of say, of these ones, which one did you feel more comfortable with? Some of the activities are physical, some of them require eyes closed for students if they want to, or they feel comfortable. Some of them are drawing based, written based. So there's a lot of different ways to contact all of the different processes, and being able to find a way that the experiential activity works with that individual is then where you can build up the behavioral repertoire of, this is the one that was chosen. Now let's practice this during session, outside of session, and see how we feel as we practice it more. So she had the psychological flexibility questionnaire as well. And then I had done an access questionnaire for the social skills group placement, and we did a mindfulness measure specifically to check in on more present moment, building up the present moment repertoire, and then the Vineland 3 specific to internalizing behaviors based off of her history. And so I will say that she's a newer client. So we've just kind of started. And so this is what her kind of Hexaflex TA looks like in terms of that she expresses understanding of the core processes and that she recognizes the activity that's related to the core processes after experiencing it as well. So we've got a couple data points here, no real clear trend so far, so we're trucking along with that. And so the other change for her specifically, structure was really helpful. So we're starting every session with a grateful activity, and this comes from the aim of noticing 10 things that you're grateful for in the present moment. And originally it was like, and because she's 19, we don't necessarily have to have mom present or a caregiver present. So she would say like, well, I'm grateful for mom. And we're like, well, mom's not necessarily here in the moment. So how do we kind of come back to that? And this tiny little dot over here is baseline on the left. So we've had 2 intervention ones, and so we're making this the start of the session so that way she can kind of get into the present moment, because the second we open the door, she's already like, when are you leaving? Thinking future. And so we want to get her into the present moment as a part of the engagement process. We're also giving breaks for her for negative reinforcement to kind of keep the engagement going, and tracking the duration of the session, which is kind of what we're looking at as the willingness or acceptance to kind of be uncomfortable in the moment. And not that we want her to be uncomfortable, but she's asked to shorten sessions, which because of her age, we honor that. And so we just continue to track when she does ask to shorten, where we are with that. And last week, she just made it through an entire session with us, and the willingness to kind of accept that we're there in her space. So I thought that was great. Okay, so case study 4, so 21 years old, autism, depression. He did have a history of suicidal ideations and a 5150, which in California is a 24 to 48 hour psychiatric hold, depending on what's going on. And he was referred for just like community engagement and conversation skills. He was not, did not want to leave his house based off of a situation that happened in the community. So there was a lot of fear around, if I leave my house, I'm going to be unsafe, in what he presented. And so we did the choice point. And so these are both related to his community engagement. And so you can see the phase change line is actually when we introduce the choice point, and this is the frequency of him going into the community. And so you can see just the last 2 months, we've had some of the highest data points for willing to leave his house and engage in the community. And the bottom one is just the weekly frequency, because our goal is that he would go on at least 3 outings per week, which since we've introduced the choice point, there's only been 1 week that he hasn't met that. Other targets that were incorporated that aren't necessarily ACT-based, but I think it's good to mention, is that the clinician and the clinical team was doing awareness training of body scanning, and kind of when he does start to escalate, where does he feel it in his body? And so that was a lot of worksheets and things like that that support the ACT interventions. And so in his choice point, he identified safety as the value, having fun as the value to go out into the community, and knowing and recognizing things like, well, it's daytime, so I'm probably more safe in the daytime, and I'm going with somebody that I want to go with. And he created a mantra for himself of like, no pain, no gain. He has a preference for like military things. And so that was helpful for him to go out into the community and pick different places to go to, and be willing to experience kind of the community and being uncomfortable out in that setting. Okay. And so the other thing that I wanted to touch on is using the AIM curriculum for social skills group. And so specifically using it for around 10 to 12-year-olds right now. And the way the groups are being structured are they're 2-hour weekly groups. And so the AIM curriculum itself is based off of a school year, and there's lessons for every school day. And it's designed to be a school-wide behavior program. And so the way I've kind of adjusted that for the group specifically is each module has about 5 lessons in it to go with a week of school. And so the goal is to get through at least 3 to 5 of the lessons per social skills group. And so the structure that we kind of have for that is the kids are reviewing the hexaflex, they're learning the vocabulary, learning how to talk about it. They're creating an AIM box for the session to talk about what's their value for that session, what's something that they want to work on, engaging in some of those experiential activities, and then they're checking their AIM box at the end of the session. And so we are doing kind of a point system for the group, so that way everybody kind of stays on topic and kind of works on some of those pieces. But based off of the assessments that we were using, we identified that the thoughts basically the kids were having were more preventative of preventing them from engaging in social skills than actually understanding what does it look like to have a conversation, what does it sound like to have a conversation, what, you know, how do I join in, like those skills they had, but it was I feel like I don't have friends, so I don't want to go up and talk to people, not I don't know how to talk to people. So we kind of separated the groups that way to accommodate the skill deficit versus a more internalizing behavior. And so this is one of the participants in the group, the task analysis for the group, and the progress and the willingness to experience. I will say she came in with a cell phone, which was nice and challenging to work through. So the first sessions were on her phone the whole time, and then as she started to get the exposure, willing to engage in the process, that we see her TA increase. And anecdotal note, last week was the first week that she was able to independently identify a move for her and her value. Everything prior to that was about other people and other people's behavior, and this past week was her behavior and how to make it different. So the awareness of how to create a committed action is increasing. Okay, so I know there's a couple questions. We've got some time left, and then just references are on the slides, and then I created a nice visual of some of the resources I've used along kind of my ACT journey and incorporating things. The value cards that are at the bottom here, I find to be really helpful to do kind of an extended values-based activity. Even though we can have lists and we can kind of come up with values, this was fun, it's colorful, and kids seem to like it. Okay, so questions. So for children who have severe cognitive and communication deficits, using their preference helps to connect them to the ACT hexaflex. So preferences in, if you're looking at maybe the values component of what's my preference in this situation, my reinforcer might be a piece of my value and how I'm working towards that. So there's some wiggle room and adjustments in how ACT is being used across different ages. I find obviously to be able to talk about the emotions that are behind certain things, the feelings, the thoughts, is definitely going to support the ACT process more. But I've seen examples of kids who refuse to the idea of like, I can't make mistakes, or they make a mistake on a paper and have, you know, tantrum behavior. And there's specific diffusion activities of like, we're actually going to measure how many problems you do wrong, and we're going to reinforce you doing wrong problems, because that's a diffusion exercise, without actually saying, we're going to do diffusion, here's what it looks like. So there's activities that you could pull for. What age and developmental level do you recommend for the AIM curriculum? So the AIM curriculum is, depending on levels, it's tiered in the curriculum itself, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and from like I'm trying to remember, kindergarten all the way to high school. You can modify some of the lessons in there from what I've read in the AIM and kind of gone through some of those things. So there's not necessarily a set age. It's school age children across different abilities. Okay, does that answer your guys' two questions? Okay, great. Are there any other questions as we wrap up?
So I actually have a question. So
Sure.
for someone who was new to the realm of ACTS and RFT, beyond the Green Book, the Learning RFT book,
Yeah.
what can someone who is brand new to this field look into?
Definitely, what is it? The Praxis website, which is where all the ACT-based trainings kind of come out of from Stephen Hayes. There's a like 40-minute free, and you get a CEU webinar on there. There's other trainings on there for ongoing consultation. There's a lot of up and coming in terms of like the conferences we all go to, ACT's coming out a little bit more. And maybe focusing, like if you want to dive into it, there's a lot more on the mindfulness and present moment than there is maybe with the ACT-based things. So looking at the literature for that to support those components. And then there's also kind of diving into the learning RFT. I think it's foxylearning.com. There's an intro to RFT. And there's great visuals that are provided within that one. And I found that one to be pretty enjoyable to kind of walk through. And it's a nice mid-level, not too high, not too low. So that one provides some good RFT context. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? I'm hoping this kind of gives everybody a little taste of ACT and maybe interest. I am thoroughly enjoying doing it with the clients. It's filling up my behavior analytic cup a little bit more because I think we could make so much change, and the private events seem scary to kind of talk about at first, but knowing that we're measuring change for the committed actions, but those, we need to understand the context of what's happening there. And that's the one thing I didn't touch on with ACT is functional contextualism. And so I'm gonna say that phrase and like give everyone homework of going and looking that up. But it is, we have our ABC model, we look at the function. Through ACT, functional contextualism has a lot of those components, but we're looking at it more broadly and using the model. Okay.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Ashley, for today's presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions they would like to send to Ashley, please email us at disseminateaba@gmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to forward those questions off to her.
Yes.
For attendees, please know that I will be sending out a Google survey with a list of questions for your certificates later today, and it's going to all be based off of today's presentation. So please expect that in your inbox by the end of today.
Thanks, Annie.
Well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, guys.